Hello, welcome to RC Video Reviews. I know what you're thinking. You watch all these great OpenTx tutorial videos and think, man, I got to get in on that action. Those Jumper T18 and Radiomaster TX16 radios look awesome. And then every reviewer out there tells you, go get Companion and install it, and you can configure your radio with Companion. You get Companion installed and you go to configure your first model, and you go to one of the most important tabs, which is the Mixer tab, and you click the box. And you see this little dialog pop up and say, what did I get myself into? Well, today we're going to spend some time demystifying what all this stuff does. And you got to remember, as a reviewer or somebody who's used this radio for quite a while, it's real easy for us to gloss over these things and not spend any time on them because they don't look imposing to us because we've used them. So I want to slow things down a little bit and go through what you see on this screen in some level of detail. Before I get into the content, I want to make a quick announcement that we've been working very hard on the channel, driving our non-subscribed to subscribe view ratio down. When I started talking about this, we were at 70%, and last night we hit 62%, which is awesome. So thanks to everybody who's hitting that subscribe button. And if you're a regular viewer here, please consider hitting subscribe. It really does matter. It helps small channels like mine get better video placement when we publish videos. And if you appreciate the amount of work that goes into putting these videos together, you can show that appreciation by hitting that subscribe button. Okay, let's get into it. You can see in this model setup, I've got a very stripped down arrangement. I'm on the Inputs tab, and I only have a single rate defined, no dual rates. In my mixes, I've matched up my inputs, and I have one extra. I'll explain that a little later. And then on outputs, I just have the 4 channels. That's it. Real simple configuration because we're really only going to be looking at 1 or 2 things on the Mixer tab. We'll start out by looking at this aileron mix line. When I open this up, you can see I've got a name field at the top, and that lets you just identify the name of the mix. So in my case, it's for an aileron. If you had 2 ailerons, say a channel 1 and a channel 5, you could call it aileron 1 and aileron 2 if you wanted to, or whatever else. Under the source field, this one's really important. There's a lot of options in here, and what can be confusing if you're new is scrolling down and looking and saying, well, I've got aileron here and I've got aileron here. What's the difference? The aileron here is a reference to the stick itself. You don't want to use that one. You want to use the one that has the I in front of it because that comes off of the Input tab. So when you see I1:AIL, what they're referring to is the aileron that you defined here. And I can show you by giving it a different name. I'm going to name this ZZZ. So when I name that ZZZ, when you come over to the mix, you see how the name changed to ZZZ? That links the input to the mixer line. That's why you always want the one that starts with I1 or I2 or I3 or whatever line on the input you put that control. Okay, I don't want to confuse myself, so I'm going to change this back to aileron. So there we go, we've got our source identified, and it's very important to use the source that's been defined on your input screen because if you don't, then things like dual rates don't work later. I always get asked, well, can I just do it here in the mixer? And I'll answer the question by saying, if you want to, you can. But you will find out later that your life gets much more complicated when you want to do things like add dual rates or add other modifiers to your inputs. So I'll advise you to follow convention and identify your sources based on what you define in your Inputs tab. Now we're getting into the meat of the matter. I think most people probably understand that, and initially when you do a model setup, the radio actually does this work for you, but this, the weight, offset curve, and all this other stuff, that's not very well explained. So let's spend some time with it. The first thing we'll look at is the weight, and before I start fooling around with the weight in the mixer, I want to show you that there's weights everywhere. There's weights on the Input tab, there's weight on the mixer, and there's even a way to limit servo travel on the output, which almost is like a weight. For me, I tend not to modify the weights in the mixers too often unless it's for something like an actual mix, like if I'm adding an elevator or I'm trying to control offset for a knob or flaps or something like that. I generally set my primary weights in the Input tab, but in the mixer, for most things, I tend to leave the weight alone. There are cases where you can adjust the weight, and we'll actually touch on some of those a little later. Predominantly, I set my fences on the Input tab. Okay, let's take a look at what weights do. On the inputs tab for the aileron, I have the weight set to 100, and likewise I have it set to 100 on the mixer. So let's bring up the simulator, and remember my ailerons are on channel 1, so here's the mixer and here's the output. I'm going to lock my stick movement and I'm going to slide this stick all the way over to the left, and you can see that my mixer is negative 100 and my output or my channel is also negative 100. That's weight. So if I go into this mix line and say, well, I only want that to be 50, watch what happens here. The mixer limits itself to 50%, and therefore the output is limited to 50%. That makes sense? So you've got a direct correlation. The mixer says, hey, we're only at 50%. So even though the input is all the way over to the left at a full negative 100, the mixer says, no, 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 we only have a weight of 50, so I'm only going to 50, therefore the output only travels to 50. This is a very important concept for later because you have to understand that the mixer feeds the output. They identify this as channels. I really would like it if they put output here in parentheses. That would help you identify that one feeds the other. So the mix feeds the output. Okay, that pretty much covers weight. So weight has an impact on travel on the output. So you can adjust the weight either in your mixer or in your input. But since we're focused on the mixer today, we're going to stay in the mixer. You'll also notice that all of these options have a checkbox for GV, and what that means is that you can assign global variables. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on global variables today because I have other videos that are focused on global variables, but if you want to use a global variable, you can assign that right here in your mixer. Well, bottom line is if you want to use a global variable for the weight, you can. In this example, since we're focusing on the function rather than the global variable aspect of things, I'm going to stick with hard-coded numbers. So therefore, we won't use any of these check marks. Those all indicate that for this particular item, you want a global variable. And since we're focused on the numerics, we're not going to use those checkboxes. The next up is the offset. And before I get into what that does, I want to show you what things look like when you have no offset. So I'm going to hit cancel there, bring up the simulator, and I want you to notice that in the neutral position, when my aileron stick is neutral, my channel output is 0. And the mixer also shows 0. Once I start moving it, of course, the channel and the mixer start to move. Okay? But when I let it go, everything is at 0. Now let's go in and put in an offset. We're just going to do a simple one, and I'll make it 10. So when I put in an offset of 10, watch what happens in the mixer when the radio fires up. You see how the channel value now changes to 10 and the mix value changes to 10? What's happened there is we've said, hey, when we start up, I want my servo to start over to either the left or the right. So you've effectively, it's almost like a trim, but that's a really bad vernacular for offset, and I'll show you why in just a minute. As you can see, when I move the stick all the way to the right now, the channel output no longer peaks at 50, it peaks at 60. You see that? The mixer is at 60% and the channel output is also at 60%. Now when we go to the other side, watch what happens. Using offset, we've also reduced the other side of the servo travel by 10, right? Because that used to be 50. Remember, without offset, it's 50-50, but now it's 60-40. So we still have the same 100 points of range, but we've moved the center over 10 points. And that is really not a good practice for servo management, and I'll tell you why. Watch this. If my weight were 100 and I used an offset of 10, look what's going to happen here. I start out with the 10% offset that we have configured, but now watch what happens when I move the stick. When I hit 100, look at the mixer output. It's at 107, and there's room to keep going. So look at that. What's happening is you're losing resolution on your stick because we've reached our channel maximum before we reach the end point of the stick. There are ways to correct that with PPM center and outputs, but that's beyond the scope of the video. The bottom line here is using offset is really not a great strategy to establish a starting position for a servo. You really want to do that either by mechanically fixing it, that's what the purist will say, or by using a sub-trim. Okay, so we're going to take offset out, and let's not use offset as a trim. Let's use trim for trim, and we'll use offset for other things. So let's just get rid of that, and we'll go back to a normal configuration. All right, let's look at an example where offset actually makes sense. Let's take a look at channel 9, and you can see I've got S2 configured with a weight of 100. So I'll bring up the simulator and look at channel 9. See how channel 9 just flipped down to negative 100? That's because my dial is all the way over here on the left. Now as I move that dial up through the midpoint, which is 0, on channel 9, well, I'm close to 0. Come on. Hard to do with the mouse. There we go. Okay, now you can see on channel 9, I'm at 0. That means my pot is at the 50% point. And then on the right-hand side, I've moved it all the way down, and I'm at 100 on channel 9. So that's the full range of negative 100 to 0 to 100 on S2 with no modifiers, okay? Now let's look at an example where adding an offset actually makes sense. All right, for channel 8, I'm going to add a gain knob, and I'm going to set the source to S2. And I will set my weight to 50 and my offset to 50. Now watch what happens in the simulator for S2. Okay, channel 9, remember, is our monitor. And channel 8 is the output for the knob based on the offset. So channel 9 shows you the full range of movement for the knob. So I'm at 0, actually I'm at negative 100. Now I'm at 0, and now I'm at positive 100. And you can see on channel 9 how we still have that same sweep of motion. That's why I left that in there, so you can see what the actual knob is doing. Now on channel 8, you can see the impact of offset. So it's the same knob, but because I use the offset, we're starting at 0. If you have a device that requires only travel on one side, this is one way to do it, is by using offset. So even though I'm all the way at the 0 position as indicated by channel 9, you can see I'm starting at 0, and as I move the knob through the full range of motion, when I hit the halfway point, I'm at 50%, which is really more like 75%. And then when I finish the sweep all the way to 100, then the output is 100. So by using an offset, what that allows me to do is set a range of motion that only goes from 0 to 100. Places that might be useful are things like a gain knob. If you have gain for a flight controller, that's a really useful trick to be able to do that. Okay, so that's a correct use of offset. You don't really want to use it to change servo positioning because you run into limits with stick travel, but for things like a gain knob, it makes perfect sense to use offset. All right, let's jump back up to the aileron line. So far we've covered weight, we've covered offset, now we're on the curve line. And on the curve line, you get even more options. You've got diff, expo, function, and curve. Let's break them up one by one. We'll start with diff. When you put differential in, that's a percentage in reduction of travel for one side over the other side. So you can see I've got my weight set at 100%. I'm going to put a differential of 10 in. And what that means is that one side will travel 90, while the other side will travel the full 100% of the servo throw. Let's take a look. Okay, notice that the aileron is at 0% because we took our offset out, but let me lock the stick and we'll move it and I'll show you where that differential comes in. I'm going to move all the way to the left and look at how channel 1 is limited to 90%, and the mixer is also limited to 90%. When I move all the way to the right, the mixer and the output both go to 100. That's differential. What differential does is it limits one side of servo travel over the other. One area you might use differential is to prevent something like adverse yaw. I know Piper Cubs and glider pilots are fond of using differential to limit adverse yaw. The theory is that you want the upswinging aileron to travel higher than the down-moving aileron, and differential lets you do that. And if you want that differential to go the other way, you simply change this value to negative. And that applies for everything else. If you want to invert your weight, you just add a negative sign. If you want to invert the offset, you also just add a negative sign. But I'll show you what it looks like real quick with the negative 10 for differential. So remember before it was 90% going to the left. Now you can see I've got 100% going to left and I've got 90% going to the right. Okay, that covers differential. Let's take a look at Expo. All Expo does is it's the same thing it does on the input screen. So if you want 20 or 30% Expo, I can't show you this in the outputs because it just doesn't graphically represent well with the simulator. But if you understand an Expo curve, you can add Expo here. That's all that does. All right, next up are functions, and if you look at the drop-down list for functions, that can look a little intimidating, but we're going to go through them one by one. For the first two, x is greater than 0 and x is less than 0, this is really simple. It just basically ignores 1/2 of travel. That's the bottom line. So if your input is greater than 0, the output follows the input. If it's less than 0, it's ignored. On this one, if the input is less than 0, the input follows the output. Otherwise, it's ignored. And I'll show you what it looks like. We'll just go ahead and set one. X is greater than 0. So we'll hit OK, bring up the simulator. We're looking for a value greater than 0. If we see that, we'll see travel on the output. So I'm going to move my stick to the right, and you can see that I've got travel. My mixer went all the way to the right, and my output went all the way to the right. Now I'm going to move my stick to the left, and look at that. Nothing. The mixer is 0, and the output is 0. So the value is less than 0, therefore we're getting no output on the channel. That's simple. Now if we flip this to be x is less than 0, the same thing happens, but it's reversed. I can move my stick to the left and input will follow, but if I move my stick to the right, input is ignored. That's all it does. The next option is the absolute value of x, and the idea here is that the output matches the input regardless of whether it's negative or positive, but it will always be a positive output. So watch what happens in the simulator when I do that. I'm going to move my stick to the right and notice what happens to my output. It goes up to 100%. Now I'm going to move my stick to the left and look at my output. It goes to 100%. So the idea here is that no matter what side of the stick you move, your output will always be positive. Okay, the next one is f greater than 0. And the idea here is real simple. If the stick is moved off of 0, the output is 100%. That's it. That's all there is to it. So here I'm going to move my stick off of 0. I'm going to lock the stick and move it off of 0. And look, I went straight to 100%. I'm only in the middle of the range, but I'm all the way at 100%. Now if I move the stick to my left, nothing happens. If I move it to the right, f is greater than 0, the output is 100%. F is less than 0 does the same thing but in reverse. So we'll simulate that. We'll move the stick to the left. And you can see I immediately drop to 100%. When I go to the right, it's ignored. The next one is the absolute value of f, and in this case the output will be 100% when the input is greater than 0. Otherwise, it's negative 100%. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So if I move it greater than 0, I'm at 100%. If I let go, or I'm anything but greater than 0, I'm negative 100%. Think landing gear. If you have landing gear, this would be a great option. You put a switch in here and just use it for landing gear. Okay, we've covered every single function under the curve list. Let's keep moving. The next box says include trim, and all this does is allow you to ignore your trim switches or use your trim switches. So for some reason you don't want trim on your aileron, you can say, I don't care what my trim switches do, turn it off. That's it. I think for the majority of cases you're going to want that to be on. The flight modes boxes allow you to select which flight modes this mixer is active in. So if you're not using flight modes, you can safely ignore this. You just leave them all checked and you'll be fine. If you are using flight modes and say you want this mix to only be available in flight modes 1 and 2, you simply uncheck these. And from now on, this mixer is only available in flight mode 1 or 2. I do have a video on flight modes if you're interested in learning more about them, but for this video, it's outside the scope of getting into flight modes in any detail. Okay, next up is a switch, and for a single input line like this, I don't really see any value of having a switch. You'd really use that if you had a second line on a mixer, and I will show you that momentarily, but for a single mix line, you really generally don't use a switch. And warning, same thing, same kind of concept. I'll get into warnings in just a minute. If you want to use a warning, it would make more sense if you'd applied an actual second line to your mix rather than just a single standalone line. And then multiplex, we're going to cover that in just a moment too. So these three things, we're going to get into those in just a moment. I want to finish up the basics by talking about delay and slow. The idea behind delay and slow is that you can delay movement. And I'll give you one example that I use all the time. If I have a flaps set up on my plane, I normally will add a delay for up and down. So I'll put in a 2-second delay for up and a 2-second delay for down, and that way when I activate or deactivate my flaps, I have an opportunity to get my hand back on the elevator stick so that if there's any adverse movement due to the application of flaps, I can control it because my hand's back on the elevator. In these two fields, you can slow the movement of a surface. So again, flaps, it's another place I use it. I slow the flap movement down and I slow it up. And that helps prevent jerkiness when you're applying flaps. So it's just one of those areas really nice to be able to speed up and slow down the movement or add a delay before the movement occurs. That's what these 4 boxes do. Okay, let's get into the last section, and that's where we're going to start doing a little bit of mixing. Now, this is not intended to be a mix tutorial, so if you want to see different mixers, I've got a video on how to do mixes. For these examples, I'm going to use the S2 potentiometer, just because it's easier to manage for videos, but you can use any surface you want. I'm just going to use my S2. When you want to add a mixer to an existing mix line, you simply right-click on the line that exists, and you hit Add. And you can see that brings up another box, and I'm going to call this, I'm just going to call it Tune. We're just tuning. And I'm going to set my source to S2, and I'm going to set the weight to be 10. I also want to add a switch, and I'm going to make my switch SA down, and I'm going to add a warning that's just going to give me 3 beeps. And I'm going to leave Multiplex alone. I'll cover that in just a minute. But let's show you what happens when you make these changes. We'll hit OK here, and now we go into the simulator. And remember, I have it set to be SA down. So when I put SA down, the first thing that'll happen is I'll get a 3 beep warning, and that'll stay in effect while SA is down. There you go. Had to turn the volume up to get it. So that's what that warn field does. When you apply this mix, it simply gives you a warning that that mix is in effect. That's it. That's all it is. Now to put this mix into effect, if I move this potentiometer to the left, notice the channel output drops down to -10. So I've got it all the way down to 0. That's -10. If I move it all the way to the right, it's +10. The reason for that is because in this mix line, I specified that I wanted the output of this potentiometer to be added to the aileron. And the limit is only a weight of 10, so we can only add or subtract 10 at a time at the max. And that explains that behavior. Notice in the simulator, if you're really paying attention to what's going on here, this effectively has just become a trim. So if I lock my stick and move over to the left a little bit, and then I move my S2 knob, notice how the output's changing. That's effectively a trim. That's exactly electrically what's going on when you trim your plane. You've got modification and it's held. When I let go, it stays there. That's a trim. All right, let's look what happens when we change our mixer to use multiply. In order to illustrate this easily in the video, I'm going to change my weight to 100, and I'm going to change multiplex to multiply. And since now we know what the warning does, I'm going to turn that off. So we're just going to turn that off, and we also now know what the switch does, so I'm going to turn that off just to make the demonstration easier. All right, so I've got the weight set at 100, and I'm using multiply as the option. Okay, let's see what happens in the simulator. I'm going to lock my sticks. I've got S2 set to -100. Now watch the output on channel 1. When I move my stick all the way to the left, and I have my value at -100, my channel output is 100%. If I move this pot to the other end to be 100%, notice that my channel flipped sides on me. It went down to -100. That's basically like a servo reverse. That's what we just did. If I move S2 to the middle, anybody know what's going to happen? It's going to basically turn off the servo because the multiplier is 0. So we're taking 100% of the weight of the aileron and we're multiplying it by 0. That's why we have 0 output. If I move the knob to say, I don't know, 20%, that's like taking 0.2 times 100, so we wind up with 20% of travel. That's what multiply does. Now you might say, well, that's kind of screwy. That might really throw me off if I did it that way. Well, how could we fix that? Well, remember earlier when we did offset? Here's a use case for offset. Let's go in and set the weight to 50, and we'll set the offset to 50 on our S2 knob. In order for our channel monitor to correctly reflect what this switch is doing, I have to make the same change on the monitor. So I'm going to set my weight to 50 and my offset to 50. That way the monitor shows what the knob is doing. Okay, so channel 9 is now at 0. I've got my switch at 0 and channel 9 is 0 to match. So I'm going to lock my sticks here. I'm going to move the aileron all the way over to the left, and notice that the aileron didn't move at all because now this far left position or far counterclockwise position is 0. That's what's represented in the output monitor for channel 9 at 0. Now if I move this up, this multiplier, well, look what happens with the aileron. See it moving? We're going from 0 all the way up to 100%. Okay, so that's multiply. The idea again is we're taking the value of this S2 knob, and right now I've got it at 50%, and you take that number and multiply it times your weight. That means our travel is 50%. So we basically cut our travel in half. Effectively what we've done here is we've put weight on a knob. We can completely control the weight of the output with this knob. Okay, the last option is replace. When I select replace for multiplex, it does exactly what you think it's going to do. Remember, I only have a weight of 50 and an offset of 50. That's probably not good for an aileron. I think we need to change that. We'll take the offset out, and let's do the same thing in our monitor. We'll take the offset out. We'll leave the weight at 50. And now you can see that when I move the stick, the aileron stick, nothing's happening. It's because we have this value set on replace, which means the stick movement is now controlled by S2 alone, because S2 is replacing the line above it. That's simple. Alright guys, that covers literally every single option on the mixer input that you've got. I hope you enjoyed that content. Your subscription would be greatly appreciated if you did. Please hit that subscribe button, and that's the payback for the hard work it takes to put these videos together. So if you appreciate the work I'm doing for you, hit subscribe. For the rest of you, you know what to do. Keep those comments coming. Leave me a thumbs up. Don't forget to check out my affiliate links for Banggood and Amazon. They're right there in the description. If you want to buy anything, channel gets a little kickback. It costs you nothing. And don't forget, I got a t-shirt store. That's all I've got for today, guys. Take it easy. We'll start out by taking a look at the aileron mix line. We'll start out by taking a look at this aileron mix line. We'll start out by opening up this aileron mix line. Are you kidding me? And I think gliders are, and I think glider pilots like to use a little, one place you might use differential, one area you might use differential thrust is, one area you might use differential is to prevent, one area you might use differential, not differential thrust. One area Alright, I'll start out by adding, I'm gonna lock my sticks to make it easier for me to show you. Now, I'm going to set